I have been muted this entire time. Amazing. Okay, I'm going to start over. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. My name is Eve Ewing. I'm the curator of the Black Freedom Lectures, and I'm sorry that you couldn't hear me. Hopefully now you can. Week 100 million of the pandemic, and I still don't know how to unmute myself. Welcome to what I know will be an incredible conversation this evening between two really wonderful guests. First, I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the unceded territory of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa nations, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. And next week, we will be having a really important conversation with Elena Roberts, who will be talking about Black and Indigenous solidarity so that we can really unpack the relationship between Black people, Indigenous peoples, the intersectional identities of Black Native peoples, and the ways we work through the important things that we have to talk about and think about together about freedom, about our relationship to the land, kinship, abolition. So I, for one, am really looking forward to that conversation. That will be, so her lecture will drop tomorrow right here on our YouTube channel in the evening. And if you want to join us for that conversation, we will be having a live Q&A next Thursday, May 6th at 6:30 Central Time. Okay, so it'll be slightly later than usual, 6:30 Central Time. Of course, if you don't want to remember any of that information, the best way to stay updated about everything we're doing is to sign up for our newsletter at blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter. That's blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter. Or you can follow us on all the social media and stay updated on all the things. Cool. I also want to thank our good friends at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture and the Mellon Foundation for supporting this conversation. And I'm really geeked to introduce our guests. But before we do that, I just want to remind you one more time, as always, that you can drop your questions or comments in the chat, and we would love to bring them into the conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our two speakers for this evening. And I also want to thank our ASL interpreter, Barb. Especially, I always am thankful for Barb, but I'm especially thankful for Barb because the only reason I knew I was on mute was because Barb was not signing, and that made me concerned. So thank you, Barb. You are the hero of the evening. So first, I want to introduce an incredible young scholar, Christopher Williams. Chris is a Neubauer Family Foundation Distinguished Scholar and a doctoral student at the PhD program in the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago. He received his BA in sociology from the University of Missouri Columbia and his JD from UC Irvine. People who have like JDs and PhDs, I think that is incredible, very impressive. I'm not trying to go to more school, but I'm happy for you, Chris, and it's really dope. And Chris's research interests are primarily at the areas of intersectionality in the law, specifically seeking to uncover the ways in which the law proliferates and exacerbates existing systems of inequality, such as racism, classism, sexism, ableism, and sexual orientation discrimination. In doing so, his research not only attempts to highlight pitfalls in the law, but also provides pathways to make the law more accessible. I'm really excited that he's going to be in conversation this evening with our featured guest, Dr. Ellis Monk, who is an associate professor of sociology. His research comparatively examines ethno-racial inequality in global perspective. More broadly, his research agenda focuses on the roles of the body and physical appearance as crucial, yet often underappreciated and understudied sources of inequality and stratification, as you saw if you checked out his incredible lecture that dropped last week on colorism. If you haven't seen it, please, please, please watch it after this is over. It was really amazing, and I think should be shared with everybody. To date, most of Dr. Monk's research uses quantitative methods to examine skin tone stratification in the US and Brazil across a wide array of domains, especially health, very relevant right now. His most recent work with Michael Esposito and Hedwig Lee considers the intersectional consequences of race, gender, colorism, and lookism on the labor market. If you don't know what lookism is, maybe he can talk about that a little bit tonight. And he also did bring it up in his amazing lecture on Friday. Straight out of Harvard University, Ellis, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm going to turn my camera off and allow these two to be in conversation. I'll come back at the end and say farewell. Want to remind everybody one more time, if you have any questions, please do drop them in the chat. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to the two of you.
Perfect. I just wanted to take a minute at the outset to appreciate Professor Ewing and the greatness that is Professor Ewing in putting this together and inviting us into this space. So I figured we could just kind of jump straight in. And I wonder, Professor Monk, if at the outset, you could really help us situate and understand what you mean by the unceasing significance of skin tone. And perhaps if you could help us understand why colorism is an understudied phenomenon.
Got it. So first of all, I also want to thank Professor Ewing and thank Chris for engaging with me here. I think this is a really great series, so it's an honor to be a part of this. You're referring to a paper that came out in the journal named Datalist, which is open source now. And I have a paper called The Unceasing Significance of Color. And the reason why I'm saying unceasing significance is because colorism, skin tone stratification, however you want to refer to it, is something that's persisted throughout all of US history. And before that, as soon as we have slavery, we have Africans on these shores, we have a system of color that quickly begins to develop. It really was part and parcel of slavery itself. So this is something that I like to highlight in my research, which is that I'm not really saying that colorism is something new. I'm saying it's something that's old, that's something that's enduring. And when I say that it's understudied, one of the reasons why I argue that it's understudied, particularly in the US, is because of the data. So if we look at the kind of data that people use, particularly quantitative data, usually it's census categories. And a census category is based on self-identification, at least since 1970 in the United States. And those census categories don't really tell us about how people look. So you can self-identify into one or more of these ethno-racial categories, but it doesn't really tell us about your physical appearance. It doesn't tell us about your facial structure, your skin tone, your hair, and all of these sorts of aspects of our physical appearance not only signify racial differences that we see in everyday life, but they're also independently associated with a lot of different outcomes like education and health, labor market outcomes, et cetera.
Yeah, excellent. And so I wonder if we can kind of drill down and get a little deeper into some of the things you highlight in the lecture, especially as they relate to colorism. Because one of the things when I watched the lecture and I heard you talk that came to mind was the word nuance, right? A lot of what your research pushes us to do is to think of nuance. And so you can imagine somebody who, looks at the lecture, goes through it, and it's like, I'm all on board with Black inequality, Black oppression. But when I go outside, the police, they just see us all as Black and treat us as so, right? So isn't this just sort of driving an unnecessary wedge? Why do I need to see colorism as important? So how would you respond to that person?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would respond first of all by pointing them to the research that shows that even if the police, the judges, et cetera, are seeing you as Black, depending on the lightness or darkness of your skin tone, there's going to be there's going to be potentially differential consequences for you in terms of how the police are treating you, the judges, the jurors, et cetera. And this has been well established before I even started my research. So it's not just a matter of believing that we're all just Black, we all look the same, more or less, we're treated equally just because we're in this category. Research shows us that that's not really true. So that's really the first thing I would say, is that this is a common way of thinking about things, but research shows it's not the reality, it's a simplification. The other thing I would say is, even when we think about a category of race dichotomously, like say someone's Black, someone's white, Asian, et cetera, we're using their physical appearance and a lot of other clues, but of course, physical appearance is one of these main things we use to put people into these categories in the first place. So really your body is always signifying these differences, regardless of whether or not we just kind of artificially lump everybody together into the same category or not.
Yeah, one of the things that I found that was really outstanding, your findings, was that you said there's as much socioeconomic inequality along the color continuum amongst African Americans as there is between African Americans and whites as a whole. And so I'm wondering, for those interested in the nuts and bolts of research, can you talk about how you actually did this work, right? So for example, you shared the slide in the lecture showing the difference in arrest rates based on skin color. Like, how did you get that data? And what determines if a person is, in the study, rated light and very dark?
Got it. So I was really fortunate that there was a resource available, the National Survey of American Life. One of the main PIs behind this is the late James S. Jackson, just an incredible talent in terms of his research in social psychology and spearheading this nationally representative data set that was nationally representative of African Americans specifically, which is so rare in quantitative research to have that kind of a resource. And one part of that data set, we're having interviewers actually rate the skin tone of the respondents in the survey. So that particular study on skin tone and the criminal justice system is using interviewer rated skin tone to give me data on what each respondent's skin tone was on this scale, from say 1 to 5, 1 to 7, from say very light to very dark.
And I wanna kind of follow up on this question. So you mentioned, as we're talking about data, right? You are pointing out sort of the limits of census data. And as researchers, right, how should we be looking at different data sources, or should we be gathering other types of data that give us more material for analyzing colorism? Like, what do you suggest we do in that sense?
So this is something that I've been personally working on throughout my own PhD, throughout my dissertation, and since then, is how do we get quantitative, how do we get qualitative data on skin tone, on facial appearance, these sorts of things that I think are really important and are often a missing piece of the puzzle when we think about social inequality, when we think about racial inequality. So I've been personally applying for a bunch of different grants that have enabled me to begin to collect nationally representative data on skin tone, some of which has already begun to be collected, collaborating with people actually at the University of Chicago. I've been working on a health-centered data set there where I have a skin tone palette and other measures of skin tone that we'll be able to use and analyze new, fresh data on these things. But my overall point, as you suggest, is that I do think as researchers, we need to actually do more to produce our own data. To the extent that we are only going to use available data in terms of these census categories, we're necessarily limited in terms of how deep, how comprehensive our understanding of racial inequality will be.
Yeah, I want to kind of switch gears here too. Even as we're thinking about academia and how we conduct research, I imagine that there are a lot more than just academics watching us. And so one of the ideas that you introduced kind of at the end of the lecture is that our bodies and the way our bodies are perceived is a form of capital that people place value in. Now, this is like not a light idea to deal with. This is something I think is kind of difficult to grapple with. I wanted to see if you could kind of explain, like, what did you mean by that? What do you mean by, our bodies are perceived as a form of capital that people place value in?
Sure. So when we think about some of the most powerful theories in the social sciences, we think about different theories of capital. So one example, of course, is economic capital. Who has more money? Simple idea. Social capital. Who has more connections, perhaps, right? And those connections are a resource that we can use. You could also think about cultural capital, right? Of course, like information, knowledge, know-how, these sorts of things. These three major forms of capital, and this is coming from the work of Bourdieu, but not just the work of Bourdieu, is really highlighting that when we want to understand what goes on in the social world, we need to understand the kind of resources, the powers that people have. And what I'm arguing, building on this work is that the body, your physical appearance, is another one of these types of resources. So for instance, if we think about something like skin tone, it's signifying your belonging in these different racial categories. And we know that in our society, that different racial categories are associated with different types of power, right? Different types of political power, different types of economic power. So your body is signifying your membership into these categories. When we think about something like physical appearance more broadly, we're thinking about things like perceptions of beauty. And we know that there's lots of research that shows that there's lots of discrimination on the basis of perceptions of beauty. And these perceptions of beauty are racialized, they're gendered. And from this research on perceived physical attractiveness, we see that people are treated differently based on how beautiful or not they appear to other people, right? So this is a power in society. Some research shows that there's inequality among people even after we take their education, IQ, whatever, into account. There's inequality in terms of how much money people are making based just on like perceptions, subjective perceptions of physical appearance, of beauty. So this is another resource in society that's unequally distributed by race and by gender. So when I say your body is a form of capital, or as I put it, bodily capital, I'm saying that your skin tone, your facial features, body size, BMI, all of these sorts of things are used by people, everyone in the world, really, all over the world, are using these different bodily markers in status hierarchies. And this is something that's determining who gets what and how much they get. And it's not just like your social connections. It's not just your political power. It's not just your economic capital. It's also this bodily capital.
Yeah, and I think this is a perfect place, if any, to kind of get into a little bit about what do you mean when you say lookism? And could you help explain to us what lookism is?
Right. So when people think about discrimination on the basis of race, they call that racism. Discrimination on the basis of color, they call that colorism. Lookism is discrimination on the basis of looks. It's discrimination on the basis of usually perceptions of who is beautiful or not, right? And we all know that these ideas around beauty are racialized and they're gendered and they have a long history. And in this society, Eurocentric standards of beauties are really dominant. So when we think about something like lookism, in my own work and in the paper that I explained at the end of the lecture that I gave, this can be a legal way, because lookism is actually a legal thing, a legal way to maintain racial inequality, not only on the labor market, but throughout society, because you can discriminate on the basis of how people look. In terms of their hair and all these other sorts of facets of their opinion. And all of this is lookism.
Yeah. I think that's a fascinating sort of term. When I first was watching it and I was looking at, and the term came across, I was kind of like, oh, this is dope. I like this right here. I want to transition to thinking about this current moment that we're in right now, right? So we're in the middle of a pandemic, which is why we're all on Zoom right now. Given that your work focuses on health, do you think skin tone stratification, colorism has been at play during the pandemic, and how things have sort of gone down with the pandemic?
I absolutely think that's the case. I think there's many ways of thinking about that. First of all, there is just in general how skin tone is associated with inequality. So one thing that we know in this pandemic is that essential workers, people who are on the front lines, have really paid a heavy toll in this pandemic. And we know that they're disproportionately Black and brown people who have been essential workers who haven't been treated very well. And I think that's not controversial to say. Well, given what we know already about skin tone stratification, I don't think it's really a leap to believe that occupational status, the probability that someone is on the front lines or not, also has a skin tone component to it.
And how can we, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to also add, we also can think of how people are treated by their doctors. So some of you may remember a Black female doctor who actually ended up passing away from COVID. And she was treated terribly by her doctors, even though she herself was a doctor. And it wasn't lost on me that she was somewhat darker skinned, she had natural hair. All these things come into play, even when you're dealing with the doctors once you get sick. So I think there's lots of different pathways for color to play a role in this pandemic.
Yeah, and even I imagine that your research has shown, even sort of before the pandemic, like we see these same sort of health disparities along the color continuum. And I'm wondering here, you know, if we could take a step back, and you do this in a lecture, and I want you to, and you know, I was wondering if you could kind of touch on it a little bit here. Where do you see sort of both in our research and in practice, sort of the origins of this disparate treatment? Like, where can we look at a point in history and say, okay, this is where we can identify, this is where this colorism thing is starting to pick up?
So I think in the United States, you have to start with slavery. Certainly the whole well-known difference between the house and the field and all those sorts of things. I think you can start there, and you can think of the sexual violence that took place during slavery that gave rise to a mixed race, lighter skin on average population that had a whole lot of privileges that darker skinned so-called unmixed people did not have, right? So I think we can start there in the United States, but if we were to be global about this, skin tone has long signified social status differences all over the world, even before slavery, even before contact with Europeans.
So thinking about that global component, right? So why do you think contemporarily, right, colorism is such a global problem now, right? Even in contexts such as your, you know, that you point out in your lecture that aren't necessarily European, right? You mentioned Brazil in the lecture. So why do you think colorism globally is still such a problem?
I think one of the reasons why it's such a large problem globally is because it's really hard for people to talk about. You know, I'm under no illusion that this is a comfortable conversation for people to have. Usually it's not, because, you know, in the US, we're much more comfortable talking about racial differences, and we're arguably less comfortable talking about those internal differences. Because these internal differences, these gradational differences, are something that affect how people are treated in their own families, among their friends. And this is definitely true in Japan. It's true in India. It's true in the African continent. And it's true in Brazil. So I think these kind of more gradational, fine-tuned differences, where people are not only the victims of this form of discrimination, but people who perpetuate it themselves. This is something that's a little more uncomfortable to deal with, and there's a lot less political, I would argue, salience around it.
So how do you propose then that, like, we begin to have those difficult conversations? Because I think your research really pushes us in that direction, that this is something that we need to start doing, right? Because like you say, we don't get a full picture of, you know, this landscape of inequality if we don't take in, you know, colorism into account. So how do we start as a community, as researchers, as folks generally interested in, you know, alleviating oppression? How do we begin to have those conversations?
Well, I mean, I think this is already a really, you know, good first step. I mean, there's many people who are also trying to get this kind of research more out into the public. So definitely, I thank Professor Ewing for putting this series together. I think more broadly, though, I think people, if I were to give some advice, I think it would be, we need to stop seeing racism and colorism as opposed. I think some people see the discussion on colorism as a distraction from discussions on racism. And I think that's something that we need to really disabuse people of. Like, that's not really the case. The overall system of racial stratification depends upon colorism. Like, you can't have the system of racial stratification without colorism, without skin tone stratification. So I think if I were to really kind of put us, you know, into a more radical moment here about trying to open up this conversation more broadly so that we can actually have some more traction, it's really trying to argue that racism is not this thing that's opposed to colorism. Colorism is not secondary, right? It's all part of this overall system. So I think when we have discussions about George Floyd, when we have discussions about police brutality, we don't need to stop at the point where we say he was Black. He was also a darker skinned Black man. Let's be intersectional and think about all the different axes of oppression that someone like George Floyd went through in his life. He didn't just deal with the fact that he was Black, he dealt with the fact that he was a Black man who was darker skinned, had a certain body size. These things actually came up in the police reports. So I think if we're going to have, a really robust conversation about colorism, more needs to be done to integrate our discussion of racism with discussions on colorism together.
Right. I think that's an excellent point that you bring up about George Floyd, because it is something that I think gets subsumed, or even Breonna Taylor, right? It gets subsumed in this conversation, and we just, glosses over everything as just Black, right? We don't look at those intersectional axes. I wanna talk about another one of your findings, and it's a complicated one, right? It's that people who are light skinned, very light skinned, when they were asked about being discriminated against, right, they said they had a high perception of discrimination within a particular racial group, within their racial group, right? Now, that's not to say that's the same as like legal discrimination, right? But if people are feeling discriminated against, that perception does have like harmful effects. So I was wondering if you could explain that finding, right? Because I think this relates to this conversation we're having about, if we're going to have real meaningful dialogue, it's going to take people to really understand what phenomenon is going on intra-group, right? So I wondered if you could help explain that for us.
Right. So this is a pattern that goes back, I think. People, especially Black people, kind of have this intuitive understanding that it's not just the case that people who are so-called too dark are getting discriminated against, getting made fun of by other Black people, but it's also possible that people who are really light-skinned are getting made fun of as well for being too light, for maybe being able to pass as white, for not being, fully accepted always as full members of the category Black, being treated as different or apart from. So in my research, one of the things I found was that there was this relationship. If we look at perceptions of skin tone discrimination just among African Americans, it's not just that darker skinned people are perceiving a lot more intra-racial color discrimination. It's also people who are very light skinned who are perceiving a lot more intra-racial skin tone discrimination than people who are kind of in this unambiguous middle, where they're not really very light or very dark. Now, one thing to kind of talk about here, and this is why I think discussions of colorism are often uncomfortable, is because this is a form of inequality I'm arguing, and I'm not alone, but this has been like the long kind of durée on this research, that Black people are also perpetuating. But one of the things I point out in my research is this is how racial domination, this is how white supremacy works. It's not just what the dominant category is doing to other groups of people. It's what that overall system of status and stratification, this overall hierarchy, does to people in the subordinate, in the dominated groups, right? So it makes you an agent of the system. It makes you an agent, gives you incentives to perpetuate this system of white supremacy and racial domination, right? And this is something I think is lost in lots of conversations around racial inequality.
Wow, that's a point right there, that I could be an agent of white supremacy, kind of unbeknownst, right? Even within this category of Blackness, to my own fellow, Black folks. I think, that could create a sense of fragility. Now, granted, I am like, a light-skinned presenting person, so I am on that privileged side. So I definitely think, that call, that being an agent of white supremacy in essence. I think it's a deeply powerful point, and one that's not really talked about as much, right? Because of that sort of uncomfortability. And so, I'm also thinking here, like, we kind of hit on this before, but I wonder, what do you think are the biggest barriers that have historically been in this conversation, right? And I'm talking intra-group here. What do you think those big barriers have been?
Do you say intra or inter?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess I mean within the Black group, right? Within that continuum.
Well, I think one of the biggest obstacles has been the overall system of racial domination. So the paper I did on Lookism and race and gender and colorism, all intersectionally kind of worked out quantitatively. One of the takeaways of that paper is, to the extent that racial inequality becomes something that's on the agenda and lots of big organizations want to integrate more, they feel more pressure. Who are the type of Black people who are going to be given the opportunities to integrate? Historically, it's been the lighter skinned people. And that is still arguably the case, right? So if you only integrate certain types of Black people, that's not true integration racially, that's not true diversity. And it sets up an obstacle because that means people have a lot of power and privilege within that category, Black. And in a way, attacking colorism might be seen as a way of dismantling their own privileges.
Yeah, so as sort of a follow-up, do you think like this phenomenon that you're talking about of lighter skinned folks being in these sort of positions, and we can think of the academy, we could think of different areas, do you think that contributes to, the discomfort with tackling colorism, research and policy and different sort of things of that nature?
I think it absolutely does. I think it does, serve to be an obstacle, because that means that, for the aggregate group of African Americans, it's much easier to just have a conversation that's just like Black people as a whole. And keep in mind that, and I point this out as well in my work, the idea that Black people are one aggregate category together, this is something that took political labor to develop. People like W.E.B. Du Bois was someone who was at the forefront of doing that kind of work. He's one of the people who called for this grouping of all Black people together, regardless of their skin tone and their parentage. People like Marcus Garvey didn't agree. Even the US Census didn't agree until the 20th century. The US Census had multiple categories, right? So what I'm saying there is not to say that Black people shouldn't be a group. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there's a lot of work that was done to make that group come together, right? While they're being treated differently by white people and by their own people. So to have this conversation is just difficult because it opens the door to these tensions within the population that really are often held in abeyance. They're kind of suspended while we get on to the real work of fighting against racial oppression, right? So what I'm trying to say, just to kind of repeat myself and to be clear, is that I think that's kind of a mistake. We need to have a conversation that brings the discussion about racial oppression and color together, because that's the overall system that we're dealing with.
Right. And given that, what you have kind of said about this, grouping of all Black people together as a part of sort of an intentional political project, right? So how do we talk then, as we're navigating these conversations, about skin tone stratification without sort of undermining that political project?
So I think the way we do that is we talk about what the overall system of white supremacy and racial domination is trying to accomplish. And we highlight that color has been used as a wedge to divide and conquer, right? If you give a certain number of people privileges within an overall oppressed category, you're setting up a buffer between yourself and the rest of the people in that category. In a sense, you're kind of paying people off, right? Historically, like, hey, we treated you well. keep everyone else in line, more or less. And if we look at a lot of our historical firsts, they tend to be lighter skinned people who are privileged. If those people who are the people who are at the political vanguard of the civil rights movement, think about that, they had to be. They were the ones who on average had more money, more power, more connections. If those people are not motivated to fight against the system of white supremacy, then that perpetuates the system. So what I say is, let's have that conversation. Let's see the system for what it is. And then it's not about undermining our solidarity. It's about saying, hey, we should band together because we see what games are being played, right? We see how the system works. And Fanon talks about this. Du Bois talks a little bit about this. Lots of people have talked about these divide and conquer strategies. This is how a system of domination works.
Yeah, and it's all encompassing, all pervasive, right? And that's why I like that unceasing significance of skin tone sort of language. I want to sort of transition here in thinking about what is it. We talked a little bit about like what we can do on a interpersonal level. I want to think more on a systemic level, right? So currently, you know, there are people in all kinds of institutions that are trying to create policies that address racism that run the gamut, right? Seems like it's a really hot topic for big corporations or even universities to be like, oh, we're committed to combating racism, et cetera, right? Like, you know, George Floyd, we're with it, like Black Lives Matter, Black Power Fist, right? Without actually addressing anything, right? So given what you've shared thus far about colorism and the unceasing significance of skin tone, you know, in the criminal, legal system, healthcare, education arenas, what policy solutions do you think would help address and combat this, right? Are there ways we can combat on a systemic level the unceasing significance of skin tone?
Well, this is why I'm glad I'm in conversation with you, someone who has a law degree, because this is something, you know, I point out in my papers towards the end of the paper. I talk about the work of Trina Jones, who's at Duke Law School, who writes about this. And one thing I'll say really quickly is our civil rights framework has the language of race or color. But for a really long time, those two characteristics were treated as essentially the same, making it basically almost impossible to sue on the basis of color because it would just collapse race and color together. So when we think about policy, I would just start with our civil rights legislation, our framework. There's research that shows that if you try to win any kind of an EEOC, some kind of a lawsuit on an intersectional basis, your chances are like slim to none. It's really hard to wage a successful intersectional lawsuit. So I think more broadly, we just need to think about the limitations of our legal frameworks, right? Our policies are designed in a way that mirror our census data and back and forth, right? They're part and parcel. Why we collect the census data is also civil rights legislation. That's why there's such an uproar when people say, oh, we don't have to worry about race. Why are we collecting race data? Well, we need that to know that there is racial inequality. So part of my argument is, and unfortunately it's a lot of work, right, is that we need to begin to rethink our entire legal framework. And this is where some of the critical race theorists really were coming from, right? We think about people like Derek Bell, one of the founders of critical race theory, right? Critical race theory came out of law schools. I think that's lost sometimes when people talk about critical race theory in the public. So what I'm arguing is that we need to undo and remake our policy structures, our legal structures. And in order to do that, we need to rethink our politics.
I think that's right. And, you know, it's interesting you bring up that as it relates to the law and how it intersects, because I think you're absolutely right that our legal framework, especially, you know, in the history of CRT that looks at a lot of anti-discrimination law, things along those lines, it is not set up in a way to adequately deal with race discrimination thus far, historically we've shown, and certainly not the more nuanced, not more, but a nuanced view of colorism in this particular way. I can't, in my mind, fathom right now how one would bring a legal claim that is not, you know, one that is distinct from sort of race discrimination, that's focusing though on colorism. I can't fathom right now where that exists in the framework of the law. And I think it definitely points to exactly what you're talking about, how we need to rethink, reframe, and restructure how we think about this, right?
Yeah, if I could just add something really quick, like one thing I see in online discussions a lot is people, unhappy with casting in Hollywood, right? And they point out colorism and casting in Hollywood. This has been on my list for a long time, to really dig in to data to try to get a handle on some of these issues, right? So imagine, you're in Hollywood, you're trying to get a job as an actor and actress, right? And you're somewhat darker skinned, and you, from your position, right, you think that you're being passed over for all these different roles because of your skin tone. And we know that skin tone is linked with perceptions of beauty. And we know that this form of bodily capital is really important in Hollywood, right? That should be uncontroversial. How can you launch some kind of a lawsuit that doesn't just say it's a racial thing, where a studio can say, hey, we hired Black people, right? What do you do then? So this is what I mean, just to try to give an example, right, about the inadequacy of our legal frameworks with things that I think are just really intuitive and obvious for people to think about.
Okay, and so I want to pivot this to another arena, because you are obviously a professor and you also look into the medical field. So within those two arenas, where do you think there's room for us to bring sort of real systemic level change, if at all possible? Or do you think it's much like the legal arena where we have to revamp the entire system? Do you think there's places or policies that would be helpful in both educational arenas or the medical arena?
So if we think about the medical arena, I mean, I think in general, and maybe this gets me into trouble sometimes with the way I think about what I work on, but I'm a revamper in general. So when people ask me these questions, I'm like, hey, we need to rebuild it. It was built this way. We can unbuild it. We can rebuild it better. Like that's typically my response to these things. It's like we should be thinking big and try to do as many changes as we can. It doesn't always sound the most practical. One thing I will say though is that I've actually been working with people at Harvard Medical School. I've been working with people at the University of Chicago Medical School. I do think there are kind of more practical on the ground interventions that can be done that add color to how they think about training their doctors. So that it's not just like racial discrimination, but it's also color discrimination. And it's also lookism, and that we can be much more intersectional about how we're training people. I have no illusions about, the power of training people out of, all of these deeply embedded cognitive biases, right? But I do think that if we're going to, do that kind of work, it can't be limited to this kind of binary, dichotomous, census category approach. Because as I point out in my research, that's just not that's just not the way the world actually works in practice. That's a simplification.
And so I guess one last question then is, as you look at, we kind of touched on this earlier, sort of a Black Lives Matter or these social movements that are encompassing folks. So not just on, I think, the big institutional level, what should our praxis be moving forward as we're looking to build movements that incorporate these things, right? How do we think about movements where we're not just doing, George Floyd as a flat Black man or Breonna Taylor as a flat Black woman, right? What should our praxis, what should be in the front of our minds as these things come up, so we're thinking about it in the appropriate way?
Well, I think this is kind of a well-worn thing I'm going to say, but I'll say it, it's intersectionality, right? This is all I'm really talking about. When I'm talking about coloring, you said it yourself, this kind of flat thing. I think in our movements, we can have a deeper approach that doesn't just kind of flatten out all of the heterogeneity that exists among African Americans, exists among any particular group, that we can begin to bring these things all to the surface and have a much more robust conversation about their physical appearance, about their class background. This is something that gets ignored a lot in these conversations around racial inequality. People don't talk about the intersection of their class, right? we can have a much more developed conversation and then point to, and I think this is really the key point that one of the things I'd like for people to take away, which is that one way that the system of racial hierarchy works is that it picks and chooses a lot. It filters among groups of people, and it treats people differentially based on how much they're approximate to the mainstream, right? So that means not just, how approximate to whiteness in terms of your physical appearance, but your class background, how you carry yourself, how you dress, how you move through the world. And if we can pay attention more broadly to how the system of stratification works in our movements and have a much more robust conversation about that, I think we'll be better off. I don't think there's anything wrong with, holding up kind of the blanket statement of Black Lives Matter and saying like, this is oppression against Black people as a group, right? But I think part of that discussion about how that oppression works is that it's not as simple always as just Black people as a group. And that's not a distraction from racial inequality. Some people see that as a distraction, right? Like, why are you splitting us up? Why are you making this more complicated? No. That's how the system works, right? So we need to have a more honest and robust conversation about how the system works if we're going to undo that system, right? And it's not somehow dampening the importance of that system to say that it's more complex than just Black people as a whole totally flat.
Right. And I think that I think to me was an excellent way to sort of wrap that whole sort of thing up. And I think, as somebody who isn't like, and I'll be vulnerable here myself, as somebody who isn't, I would say, always thinking about colorism, and it's partially probably because of my own privilege. I think this is a very useful and convicting way of moving forward, convicting in a good sense, right? Convicting in that this is how I need to be thinking about how I move in the world and the type of research we all need to be pushing towards, right? And how we think about, folks who we claim to be in solidarity with. And so I just wanted to thank you for that, because I think it's a very powerful, meaningful, and impactful way that we should all be challenging our worldview, right? That we can't just think in these short generalities, because as you stated so eloquently, right, we might be serving to just reinforce white supremacy in and of itself, right? So thank you for that, and thank you for that lecture, and thank you for being in conversation with me tonight.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you both so much. I truly can't thank you enough. I also want to shout something out, which is that for those that don't know, the concept of intersectionality, which both of y'all brought up tonight, right? For those in the audience who don't know, Kimberly Crenshaw, who, as folks do know, is one of the originators of this concept, partially writes about it from the point of view of Black women not being able to seek legal redress in the courts, right? And so the concept of intersectionality comes from Black women who are experiencing workplace discrimination. And when they go and try to sue for it, their employer is able to say, well, it's not gender discrimination because look at all these white women we have employed. It's not racial discrimination because look at all these Black men that are in positions of leadership. And the courts literally did not have a framework for understanding that somebody could be Black and a woman at the same time, right? Mm-hmm. And so to me, that is so instructive. And I think, Ellis, you just gave somebody a really good free research idea. If there's any students out there or scholars that are looking for something to do, this analysis of Hollywood casting, I think right now, research that you can do without leaving your house is like at a premium. That is, somebody please do that study. You can, pull what are the top grossing movies with Black leads or with major Black actors in the last year. You can pick whatever your data set is. Ultimately, it's going to result in you getting to watch a lot of movies as research, which to me sounds like a major win. And let's get the statistical analysis so that we can have that cycle of using the research to inform the law so people have a mode of seeking redress. So thank you both so much. That was really terrific. As we say farewell to our guests, I just want to make some other quick announcements. Don't log off yet. Next week, we're going to have the incredible Elena Roberts talking about Black and Indigenous solidarities. And I said earlier that everybody should sign up for the newsletter. There's another great reason you should sign up for our newsletter at blackfreedomlectures.org/newsletter. And that's because we're going to do a book giveaway. So we're giving away books every single week. And this week, Professor Monk has recommended some great books to get into understanding more about colorism. We'll be giving those away and purchasing them from our good friends at Semicolon Bookstore, which is a Black woman-owned bookstore here in Chi City. I want to say thank you again once more to our wonderful moderator, Chris Williams. Thank you to Ellis Monk, not only for your wonderful insights tonight, but for the terrific lecture which you dropped last week, which was so great. Thank you again to Barb, our ASL interpreter. Thank you to everyone at the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture and the Mellon Foundation for supporting the speaker series. And special thanks to Sianda and Imani, who are our wonderful graduate assistants who do all the work behind the scenes to make this possible. I'm Eve Ewing. I appreciate all of you, and I hope